In other words, the essential thing here is to see clearly, to think clearly, that is dangerously, and to answer clearly the innocent first question, what fundamentally is colonization? To agree on what it is not, neither evangelization nor a philanthropic enterprise, not a desire to push back the frontiers of ignorance, disease, and tyranny, nor a project undertaken for the greater glory of God, nor an attempt to extend the rule of all law, to admit once and for all, without flinching at the consequences, that the decisive actors here are the adventurer and the pirate, the wholesale grocer and the ship owner, the gold digger and the merchant, appetite and force, and behind them the baleful projected shadow of a form of civilization which at a certain point in its history finds itself obliged for eternal reasons to extend to the world scale the competition of its antagonistic economies. We take our case in point or our charge today from Aimé Césaire, his discourse on colonialism in 1955. My name is Dr. Lee Jones. It's my honor to bring these words to you today. And my contribution today is to offer that the Orange Iago is in the White House. Our goal is to offer a Leninist analysis of US imperialism using MK Ultra as a historic case in point. Friends, the blood is running in the streets. As of this recording, late January 2026, the Orange administration is shooting women in the face, killing Second Amendment supporting nurses, dragging half-naked old men out of their house, and arresting 5-year-olds, all citizens. The blood is running in the streets as ICE commanders are dressed like Nazis. This is a time for activism, general strikes, electoral participation, and analysis. Well, in this hour, we do that analysis. Today, I choose Shakespeare's Iago to frame my criticism of the MAGA administration's imperialism using MK Ultra as a historic case in point. In Susan Williams' book, White Malice, she goes into detail on how the CIA set itself against those who would serve the cause of African independence. In chapter 20, she offers 13 pages of detail on how the CIA used MK Ultra to further its Cold War imperialist aims in Africa by poisoning African leaders. MK Ultra chief scientist Sidney Gottlieb travels to the Congo to unsuccessfully poison Lumumba. And in her book, Williams helpfully quotes Paul Robeson Jr. about how he believed that the CIA's MK Ultra poisoned his father, Paul Robeson, at a Moscow party in 1961, this in an attempt to make him kill himself. Paul Robeson's most famous character is Othello, and just as the CIA set itself against Robeson, Iago set himself against Othello. There is a parallel that is begging to be made here. Further, as we work to understand the current imperialist convulsions, there are these immediate similarities that we can make between the Orange President and Shakespeare's Iago. First, Iago creates chaos as a form of distraction to hide his true motives, just as Trump uses social media to post racist and provocative memes to hide the true money grab his administration is grafting. Second, Iago was a master of using insinuation and innuendo to implant falsehoods into Iago and Brabantio's mind. Iago would say, "Look to your wife and observe her well," and say, "I speak not yet of proof." Well, Trump constantly says, a lot of people are saying, and I've been hearing. Both Iago and Trump specialize in making fact-free claims of blame and guilt, which cause the weak-minded to fall in line. Third, And importantly, both Iago and Trump use race as a wedge distraction. Iago engaged in racial villainy, telling Desdemona's father, quote, an old black ram is tupping his white ewe, end quote, calling Othello a ram, or in other words, calling him an animal, playing on the racial fears of black sexual potency. Iago reveals his own sexual and racial jealousy when he says, quote, I do suspect the lusty Moor hath leaped into my seat. And Iago is proven successful in his racial provocations when Desdemona's father says, quote, if such actions may have passage free, both bond slaves and pagans shall our statesmen be. Meaning that if his white daughter marries a black man, white people will be reduced to slavery. Well, in an all too similar vein, Trump uses race as a wedge distraction, and this use is as evident as his orange spray tan. He has claimed that immigration is, quote, poisoning the blood of America, a near direct line from Hitler's Mein Kampf. Trump has called African countries shitholes. He has said Haitians are eating cats and dogs and called Somali immigrants garbage. So my comparison here is on some sound footing in the area of using chaos as a distraction, manipulation through insinuation, and using racism as a wedge. Trump is as Iago. Iago's goal is to undermine Othello. The Trump administration looks to undermine the administrative state. Iago has a wife of his own, but wants Othello's wife. The United States has natural resources of its own that remain untapped, talking wind and solar, but instead wants Venezuelan oil. And Iago is ruthless in undermining others, just as the Trump administration is ruthless in getting what they want. But yet, let us remember, Iago does not enjoy a happy ending. Trump can stab American democracy in the back, just as Iago stabs his wife Amelia. But in the end, Iago is arrested, stabbed himself by Othello, and consigned to a life of legal torture. Thus, like Shakespeare's Iago, the successes of the Trump administration may look vast and deep at first glance, but moral ruin and the loss of power may be the final result. Yes, Trump and MAGA America can kidnap Maduro, undermine Zelensky, and target Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, just as in the famous play Iago can defeat Rodrigo and Cassio and Othello, but the Desdemona of material resources and regional power will not benefit Iago Trump in the long run, I suspect. Now let's remove the emperor's clothes and reveal his naked motivations. In Lenin's 1916 famous text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin classically points the way forward. In short, one is able to identify imperialism by five major characteristics. One, the concentration of capital and production into a monopoly that displaces free competition. In that capitalism is built on an Adam Smith invisible hand notion of free competition, the development of monopolies reveals a core contradiction. Competition produces a monopoly that destroys competition. Currently, we see the Trump administration pushing the major oil companies to invest their capital into the Venezuelan oil industry. So here, we can see the attempt at absorption of a foreign resource, oil, into the sphere of U.S. monopoly capital. Second, corporate or industrial capital merges with bank capital to create finance capital, which is controlled by a globally powerful oligarchy. The Trump administration, for the benefit of the oil industry, is exporting its capital to secure long-term profits from the peripheral territory. Recent reporting shows that Trump has personally profited $1.4 billion since returning to office. Third, center states develop a surplus of capital, which diminishes domestic products, so the export of capital becomes crucial. The financial oligarchy is driven by the search for higher profits off the exploitation of resources in peripheral states. In the current case, we see the export of capital towards the Venezuelan oil market. This is the ultimate goal of rebuilding the Venezuelan infrastructure so that the United States can profit from it. Fourth, international monopolies, or in Lenin's words, trusts. These arise to divide profits from the internationalization of finance capital amongst themselves. This then leads to the development of spheres of influence based on access to specific markets and the extraction of capital and profit. The latest reporting the latest reporting shows that profits from the seizure of Venezuelan oil are being housed in a Qatari bank account controlled by Trump and Rubio and managed by Treasury Secretary Bessent. And closely related is number five. The world is then divided amongst the great capitalist states who use the power of their capital and the force of their militaries to dominate their spheres of influence. From a Leninist perspective, the capture of Maduro is one in a long line of efforts to redivide a territory that has drifted towards the influence of rival blocs. I bring to your memory that Russia and China had invested billions into building relationships with the Maduro regime. Russia and China could engage a counterreaction to their loss of this investment. From a Leninist perspective, this form of naked imperialism leads to the struggle for access to resources and markets. This in turn leads to a competition between financial oligarchs looking to expand the use of their capital, and this leads to imperialist wars. As Lenin put it, quote, the result was the formation of two triple alliances. Competition becomes transformed into monopoly. The result is immense progress in the socialization of production. As the world is divided into the multipolar spheres of Russian, Chinese, and American dominance. From at least the late 1940s to around 1973, the CIA engaged in a secret and illegal program to experiment with altering the human mind, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles, implemented by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and supervised by Richard Helms. Their goal was to counter what the American government believed was a Soviet plan to engage in mind control. The CIA used electric shock therapy, sexual torture, hypnosis, and illegal drug traps to try and alter, and control the minds of often unwitting participants. In 1973, the CIA Director Richard Helms ordered Sidney Gottlieb to destroy the hard records of MK Ultra, yet it is still possible to piece together some of their most shocking activities. This is a story of mad science, imperialist surveillance, and political assassination. This is a story of imperialist devilry at its worst. A James Bond villain, Blofeld, would look at what the CIA is doing and say, wait a minute, this is too daggone far. A few examples to set the context straight. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA paid prostitutes to pick up men and bring them to CIA set up brothels with one-way mirrors so agents can monitor them. The Johns and the prostitutes would be drugged for days and observed. Further, in the 1950s and 60s, the CIA used a mental hospital in Montreal to engage in mind control and brainwashing experiments on over 100 patients, some new mothers dealing with postpartum depression. Electroshock therapy, mega doses of LSD, and repetitive messaging is used to try to reduce them into a blank and thus suggestible state. Further, in 1955, Operation Big Buzz drops 300,000 mosquitoes from aircraft using E-14 bombs on a black neighborhood called Carver Village in Savannah. And then again, in the early 1950s, the CIA, operating out of Fort Detrick, dropped 600,000 mosquitoes infected with dengue and yellow fever on a black neighborhood called Avon Park, a black neighborhood in Avon Park, Florida. The supposed goal was to see if people infected with yellow fever can be induced into a suggestive, mind-controlled state on a large neighborhood scale. Further, in the 1940s and 50s, the CIA worked with MIT to give teenage boys with intellectual disabilities radioactive oatmeal, supposedly for some Cold War reason, but as we now understand it, ultimately the goal was to assist the corporation Quaker Oats, which was engaged in a corporate rivalry with Cream of Wheat. In the 1950s and 60s, MK Ultra engaged in Operation LAC, or Large Area Coverage, and sprayed a toxic cloud of zinc cadmium sulfide on the black public housing complex called Pruitt, I'm going to say IGO, rather, IGOE. This is in St. Louis, using modified station wagons to monitor the effects of radioactive poisoning on large populations. Well, I offer these examples to press the point that the CIA and MK Ultra are agents of the most obscene forms of imperialist exploitation. Pregnant Indian women are given radioactive bread. Black Army Private James Thornwell is kept in an isolation chamber and forcibly given LSD to try and wipe his mind. Gottlieb even slips LSD into the drinks of his own scientists in November 1953 at a resort called Deer Creek Lake. And when he couldn't be kept quiet, MK Ultra's own scientist named Frank Olson winds up falling out of a window in Manhattan in 1975. Well, our theme today is the imperialism. So let's see how MK Ultra activities can be seen through a Leninist lens. First, Lenin tells us that the state is an instrument of the ruling class to suppress the majority to engage in global competition where the stakes are so high that the state must develop scientific methods of maintaining order. MK Ultra then is not an isolated not an isolated project or the result of loose cannon CIA agents, but instead is an effort to perfect forms of popular suppression where the human mind becomes a strategic asset to allow the state to maximize its control. Secondly, Lenin says that under imperialism, the quote, process of technical invention and improvement becomes socialized, end quote, or collected into a large scale industrial complex which is controlled by the state. In our comparison, MK Ultra is the use of public resources, themselves strengthened by state control monopoly capitalism, that combines public resources and supposedly private universities with military assistance to turn science and psychology into a weapon for imperialist stability. Third, Lenin is clear that the imperialist state must control their own population to prevent instability at home while they engage in extreme monopoly capitalism exploitation abroad. MK Ultra, with his mind control experiments and attempts at behavior modification, then is an example of parasitism and the decay of capitalism for Lenin. Domestic populations must be controlled, and the best way to do this is to find out how to make labor psychologically incapable of resistance. And fourthly, the imperial state is always in a state of competition and conflict with its global rivals. For Lenin, there is a constant battle for hegemony. MK Ultra, at least at the beginning, represented the fear that the Soviets were further along in brainwashing experiments, so MK Ultra represents an arena in that competition where imperialist world powers compete for strategic advantage of human capital both at home and abroad. This is the challenge that we're faced living under the administration of the Orange Iago. And I'll leave it here for now, for as Cesare said, after all, we must resign ourselves to the inevitable and must say to ourselves once and for all that the bourgeoisie is condemned to become every day more snarling, more openly vicious, ferocious, more shameless, more summarily barbarous, that it is an impeccable law that every decadent class finds itself turned into a receptacle into which there flow all the dirty waters of history, that it is an universal law that before it disappears, every class must first disgrace itself completely on all fronts, and that is with their heads buried in the dunghill that dying societies utter their swan songs. Thank you.